You don't belong in this seat, and you certainly don't belong on my plane." The words cut through the first-class cabin like a blade, followed by the sharp crack of flesh meeting flesh that would echo around the world within hours, destroying careers and exposing corruption that reached from Manhattan boardrooms to London smuggling operations. The fluorescent lights of JFK's Terminal 4 buzzed with that particular frequency that only seasoned travelers seemed to notice a low hum that burrowed into your skull after the first hour of waiting. For Zara Mitchell, the noise was just another layer of exhaustion clinging to her 24-year-old frame, like expensive perfume she couldn't afford to wear in public. She adjusted the oversized charcoal gray hoodie bearing the faded logo of Columbia University, pulling the sleeves down over hands that had signed documents worth more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. Her dark jeans were genuine designer pieces but worn enough to look like clearance rack finds, and her white sneakers had been deliberately scuffed to complete the image of a college student traveling on someone else's dime. To anyone glancing her way, Zara looked exactly like what she wanted them to see. Another young woman heading home for the holidays on a budget ticket, or perhaps someone who had rolled out of bed to catch a last-minute red-eye because the fare was cheap enough to justify the inconvenience. She was neither, and that was precisely the point. 3 days ago, Zara had completed the most complex financial transaction of her career, injecting $450 million into Sky Vista Airlines to prevent the legacy carrier from filing bankruptcy before the Christmas travel season. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was about to board one of the very aircraft her money had saved, sitting in a seat she had technically purchased with her own investment. Only 3 people in the world knew that the quiet young woman in the departure lounge was the hidden force behind TechVantage Equity, the most aggressive and successful turnaround firm on Wall Street. Her lawyer knew because contracts required signatures. Her grandmother knew because Nana had raised her to never forget where she came from. And Richard Chen knew because as CEO of Sky Vista Airlines, he had shaken her hand across a mahogany conference table and promised her that every passenger would be treated with dignity and respect. That promise was about to be tested in ways none of them could have imagined. Zara watched the gate area with the trained observation skills that had made her fortune in corporate restructuring, noting how airline staff interacted differently with different types of passengers. The elderly white businessman in the expensive suit received warm smiles and immediate assistance. The young Latino family with multiple carry-on bags got stern looks and pointed reminders about weight restrictions. The middle-aged black woman in nurse scrubs was questioned twice about whether she was in the correct boarding area. These weren't accidents or isolated incidents. They were patterns, and Zara had built her career on recognizing patterns that others missed or chose to ignore. The memories came flooding back without invitation, as they always did in airports. She was 12 years old again, clutching her grandmother's hand as they stood in line for a flight to visit relatives in Atlanta. Her grandmother had saved for months to afford those tickets, purchasing them with the same careful planning she applied to everything else in their modest life. They had been stopped 3 times before reaching their seats. Each airline employee more suspicious than the last about whether a black grandmother and her granddaughter belonged in the main cabin they had rightfully purchased. The humiliation had burned deeper than any physical pain, teaching young Zara that money meant nothing if people decided you weren't worthy of basic human dignity. That experience had planted a seed that grew into something much larger than revenge. It had become a mission to ensure that no child would ever have to feel ashamed of taking up space they had every right to occupy. Zone 1. Boarding first-class passengers only announced the gate agent, a tired-looking woman named Jessica, whose tight bun and clipped voice suggested someone who had dealt with too many difficult passengers in too few hours. Zara stood up from her waiting area seat, slinging her worn leather duffel bag over her shoulder. She had deliberately chosen the most understated luggage she owned, nothing that would signal wealth or status to casual observers. She was the first person in line, having positioned herself strategically near the boarding door 20 minutes earlier. She held out her phone, the digital boarding pass illuminating her face in the harsh terminal lighting. Jessica looked at Zara, then at the first-class boarding sign, then back at Zara, with an expression that spoke volumes about assumptions and expectations. She didn't scan the phone. Miss Jessica said, her voice dropping into that particular patronizing register reserved for people she believed were in the wrong place. "This is Zone 1 boarding. General boarding for economy starts in about 20 minutes, so you'll need to step aside and wait with the other passengers." Zara didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't show any of the irritation that was beginning to simmer beneath her calm exterior. She had experienced this dance too many times to be surprised by the steps. "I know what zone this is," she replied quietly, her voice carrying just enough authority to make Jessica pause. "I'm in seat 1A. Jessica let out a short breath that wasn't quite a scoff, but wasn't quite professional either. The kind of sound that suggested she was dealing with someone who clearly didn't understand how airline seating worked. "Please check your ticket again, miss. Seat 1A is reserved for full-fare first-class passengers, and economy seating is in rows 30 through 60. "Scan the code," Zara said softly, using the gate agent's name with deliberate precision that made the woman flinch slightly, probably wondering how this college-aged passenger knew her name when she hadn't introduced herself. Jessica picked up her scanner with obvious reluctance, fully expecting to hear the angry red beep that would confirm her suspicions about this young woman's confusion. Instead, the scanner emitted a pleasant green chime, and Jessica's computer screen displayed information that made her mouth fall open slightly. Passenger, Mitchell Zara A. Seat 1. A Diamond Elite status holder. The screen read along with a priority flag that indicated this was not someone to be questioned or delayed. The jet bridge connecting the terminal to the aircraft felt like walking through a tunnel between two different worlds, the sterile airport environment giving way to the carefully crafted luxury that airlines use to justify their premium pricing. Zara had walked down hundreds of similar bridges, but tonight she was seeing everything through different eyes, evaluating every detail as both passenger and secret owner. The Boeing 777 first-class cabin was designed to impress with soft cream leather seats that could fully recline into beds rich walnut wood finishes that caught and reflected the warm overhead lighting and enough personal space that each passenger felt like they were traveling in their own private office rather than sharing a metal tube with 200 other people. "Welcome aboard," said the flight attendant, who greeted her at the aircraft door, a woman whose name tag identified her as Carmen Rodriguez. Carmen had the kind of warm, genuine smile that suggested she actually enjoyed her job. Though Zara noticed that the smile faltered for just a fraction of a second when she took in the Columbia University hoodie and scuffed sneakers. To Carmen's credit, she recovered almost instantly, her professional training taking over. "Can I help you find your seat tonight?" she asked, maintaining eye contact and speaking in the tone reserved for valued customers. "I've got it." "Thanks," Zara replied, appreciating the effort even if she had detected the momentary hesitation. "Seat 1A. She moved toward the front of the cabin, past the galley area where two more flight attendants were preparing pre-departure beverages, and settled into what was arguably the most prestigious seat on the aircraft. The seat directly behind the first-class partition with unobstructed legroom priority service and a view that encompassed both the cabin and the cockpit area. Zara tossed her duffel bag into the overhead compartment with practiced efficiency and sank into the wide, plush seat that probably cost more for one night's use than many people spent on rent. She pulled a pair of noise-canceling headphones from her bag, preparing to disconnect from the world around her and focus on the work that awaited her in London. The plan was simple: fly incognito to the Sky Vista hub at Heathrow, spend 3 days observing operations without anyone knowing the owner was watching, then return with a clear understanding of where the company's culture needed the most urgent attention. She had learned from previous acquisitions that executives performed differently when they knew the money was watching, and she wanted to see how her investment was really being managed. That plan lasted exactly as long as it took for the cockpit door to open and Captain Derek Hawkins to step into the cabin. Hawkins was a man who looked like he had been cast in a movie about airline pilots from an earlier era, when the profession carried more mystique and less scrutiny. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his jawline suggested expensive dental work, and his uniform was tailored just slightly too tightly around his midsection, creating the impression of someone trying to maintain an image from his younger days. He radiated that particular kind of authority that came from 3 decades of being treated as the ultimate decision-maker in a confined space where his word was literally law and questioning his judgment could result in federal charges. He stepped out of the cockpit laughing about something he had been discussing with his first officer, but his laughter died abruptly when his eyes swept across the first-class cabin and landed on seat 1A. Zara was scrolling through her emails on her phone, completely unaware that she had become the focus of intense scrutiny from someone who was not accustomed to seeing people like her in places like this. Hawkins stood motionless for several long seconds, his expression shifting from amusement to confusion to something that looked uncomfortably like disgust. He walked toward the galley area where Carmen was preparing champagne service, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the aircraft's flooring with the kind of deliberate sound that suggested someone who wanted his presence to be noticed and respected. Carmen Hawkins said, his voice carrying the tone of someone issuing instructions rather than making conversation. "Why is the seat map showing seat 1A as occupied?" Carmen looked up from the bottle she was opening, glancing toward Zara, and then back to the captain with some confusion about why this would be a question worth asking. "Because the passenger has boarded and taken her seat, Captain," she replied in the kind of matter-of-fact tone that suggested this should be obvious. Hawkins followed her gaze toward Zara, and his expression made it clear that what he was seeing did not match his expectations for the type of person who should be occupying the airline's most expensive real estate. "Her," he said as if the word itself was distasteful. "In 1A. That's impossible. She has a valid ticket." "Sir," Carmen said, her voice becoming more cautious as she sensed the captain's growing agitation. "I checked it myself when she boarded. Full fare first class with Diamond Elite status." Hawkins shook his head dismissively as if Carmen had missed something obvious that should have been apparent to anyone with basic common sense. "Computer glitch," he said with confidence. "Or maybe she's flying on staff travel. Someone gave her a buddy pass and she doesn't understand the restrictions." Carmen pulled up the passenger manifest on her tablet, scrolling through the information, while Hawkins watched impatiently. "I've checked the system twice, Captain," she said carefully. "It shows a full revenue ticket purchased with her personal credit card, no staff discounts or promotional rates applied." "Look at her," Hawkins said, gesturing toward Zara with barely concealed irritation. "Does she look like someone who can afford to pay $12,000 for an airline seat?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Carmen visibly uncomfortable. She had been trained to treat all passengers with equal respect, regardless of their appearance. But she was also trained to defer to the captain's authority on all matters relating to flight operations and passenger management. "Sir," she said quietly, "the ticket is legitimate, and she hasn't caused any problems or violations of our passenger conduct policies." Hawkins narrowed his eyes, processing information that didn't fit his worldview. "We have Senator William Brooks flying with us tonight," he said, as if this explained everything. "He's in seat 4B, but I promised him seat 1A for privacy and legroom. He needs space to work on sensitive legislative matters during the flight." "The cabin is completely booked," Captain Carmen replied, her voice becoming more strained as she realized where this conversation was heading. "I can't move a paying passenger who has done nothing wrong." "You can if she doesn't actually belong there," Hawkins said, his voice rising slightly as his patience wore thin. He turned his full attention toward seat 1A, and Carmen could see the wheels turning in his mind as he prepared to handle what he clearly viewed as a problem that needed immediate resolution. Hawkins approached seat 1A with the kind of measured stride that suggested someone accustomed to having his presence command attention and respect. Though Zara remained focused on her phone screen scrolling through financial reports with the absorbed concentration of someone who had learned to work efficiently in chaotic environments. "Excuse me," Miss Hawkins said, and somehow he managed to make the word "miss" sound like an insult rather than a polite form of address. His tone carried the same energy that some people reserved for addressing children who had wandered into spaces where they didn't belong. Zara looked up from her phone, sliding her noise-canceling headphones down around her neck with deliberate slowness. Her expression remained completely calm, her dark eyes meeting his gaze without any of the deference or intimidation that Hawkins was accustomed to seeing when he addressed passengers who weren't meeting his expectations. "Yes, Captain," she replied, reading his name tag and using his title with the kind of professional courtesy that suggested she understood exactly who she was dealing with, even if she wasn't particularly impressed by the revelation. "I need to see your boarding pass," Hawkins said, extending his hand with the kind of authority that suggested compliance was not optional. "There appears to be some confusion about the seating arrangements tonight." "I already showed it at the gate," Zara replied, her voice remaining steady and reasonable despite the obvious implication that she had somehow deceived her way onto the aircraft. "I need to see it again," Hawkins insisted, his voice becoming more demanding. "We're showing a conflict in our reservation system, and I have reason to believe you may be in the wrong seat." Zara reached into her pocket and retrieved her phone, pulling up the digital boarding pass that clearly displayed her name, seat assignment, and Diamond Elite status. She held the screen toward Hawkins, giving him plenty of time to examine every detail of the legitimate documentation. Hawkins barely glanced at the phone screen before dismissing it with a wave of his hand as if the evidence contradicted conclusions he had already reached through other means. "Right," he said, nodding as if her cooperation had confirmed his suspicions. "As I suspected, we have a double booking situation here. This seat is actually reserved for a VIP passenger who requires privacy for official government business. I paid $11,000 for this seat," Zara said, her voice remaining level despite the absurdity of what she was hearing. "I'm not moving." The first-class cabin, which had been filled with the quiet sounds of passengers settling in for the long flight ahead, suddenly became deadly silent. Conversations stopped, newspapers rustled to stillness, and electronic devices were paused as other travelers became aware that something unusual was happening in the front row. Senator William Brooks, a heavy-set man with the kind of red face that suggested either high blood pressure or frequent alcohol consumption, looked up from his tablet in seat 4B with obvious interest. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, an elderly British socialite traveling in seat 2A, discreetly positioned her phone to capture what appeared to be developing into an entertaining confrontation. In seat 2, B-Tech executive James Park had been live-streaming to his social media followers about luxury travel experiences. But now he quietly adjusted his camera angle to focus on the unfolding drama, sensing that his audience was about to witness something far more compelling than his usual content about airport lounges and premium cabin amenities. Hawkins felt the weight of all those watching eyes, and his face began to flush with the kind of color that suggested someone whose authority was being challenged in public. He wasn't accustomed to passengers who refused his instructions, especially passengers who looked like they should be grateful for whatever accommodations they received. "Listen to me very carefully," Hawkins said, leaning closer to Zara's seat and lowering his voice to what he probably thought was a menacing whisper. "I have been flying these aircraft for 30 years. I have transported presidents, foreign dignitaries, and members of Congress. I decide who sits where on my aircraft, and I'm telling you that you don't belong in this seat." "Captain Hawkins," Zara said, using his name with the same deliberate precision she had used with the gate agent. I suggest you check the passenger manifest one more time, and I strongly recommend that you review any special notes attached to my passenger profile before you continue this conversation." Hawkins let out a harsh laugh that contained no humor whatsoever, the kind of sound people made when they were dealing with someone who had clearly overestimated their own importance. "Passenger profile. Special notes," he repeated mockingly. "You think you're special because you managed to buy a ticket I've been flying since before you were born, young lady? I know exactly what type of person you are." "And what type is that?" Zara asked quietly, her question carrying enough weight to make several nearby passengers lean forward in their seats. Before Hawkins could respond, Senator Brooks cleared his throat loudly from seat 4B, reminding everyone of his presence and his expectation that this situation would be resolved quickly and in his favor. Arthur the senator called out, using Hawkins's first name with the familiarity of someone who had dealt with him many times before. "What's the holdup here? I thought you said seat 1A would be available for my use tonight." Hawkins straightened up, pleased to have powerful backup in his corner. "It will be Senator," he replied with renewed confidence. "I'm just explaining to this young lady that there's been a misunderstanding about her seating assignment, and we're going to get her sorted out with something more appropriate." "More appropriate," Zara repeated, and for the first time since the confrontation began, there was an edge in her voice that suggested Hawkins was approaching dangerous territory. Something in the back of the aircraft, Hawkins clarified, gesturing vaguely toward the economy section. "I'm sure we can find you a middle seat somewhere around row 40 where you'll be more comfortable with passengers in your price range." The atmosphere in the first-class cabin shifted like barometric pressure before a hurricane as passengers realized they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple seating dispute. James Park's live stream counter showed over 15,000 viewers, and climbing as word spread through social media that something dramatic was unfolding on a commercial aircraft at one of the world's busiest airports. Hawkins stood over Zara's seat with the kind of aggressive posture that made it clear he considered this conversation finished, regardless of what she might have to say about the matter. He had made his decision based on factors that had nothing to do with tickets or reservations, and now he was simply waiting for her to accept reality and comply with his instructions. "I'm not moving," Zara said again, her voice carrying a steel edge that cut through the cabin noise with surgical precision. "I paid for this seat with my personal credit card, I have valid documentation, and I have every legal right to occupy the space I purchased." "Legal rights," Hawkins repeated, his voice rising loud enough that passengers in economy could probably hear him through the cabin partition. "I'll tell you what's legal, young lady. I am the captain of this aircraft, which means I have absolute authority over who flies on this plane and where they sit. If I determine that you're a disruptive passenger or a security risk, I can have you removed by federal marshals." Carmen Rodriguez watched the confrontation escalate from the galley area, her hands trembling slightly as she realized she was witnessing her captain threaten a passenger who had done absolutely nothing wrong except exist in a space where he didn't think she belonged. She had seen Hawkins display prejudice before, usually in more subtle ways, but never so blatantly and never in front of witnesses who were clearly documenting everything. Mrs. Patterson, the British socialite in seat 2A, had positioned her phone to capture a clear view of both participants in the argument, her aristocratic features showing obvious disapproval of Hawkins' behavior. She had traveled on hundreds of international flights and had never seen a captain treat any passenger with such overt hostility, regardless of their appearance or perceived social status. Captain Zara said, her voice becoming dangerously quiet. "You're making accusations about my behavior and my character based on nothing more than your personal assumptions about who I am and whether I belong in this seat. That's not law enforcement, that's discrimination, and it's about to become a very expensive mistake." Hawkins felt his face flush red as he realized this young woman was not only refusing to be intimidated, but was actually challenging his authority in front of passengers he was trying to impress. Senator Brooks was watching the entire exchange with obvious interest. and Hawkins knew that his reputation with powerful political figures depended on his ability to handle situations like this decisively. Discrimination. Hawkins laughed, but the sound was harsh and artificial. I'm discriminating against passengers who don't know their place and who think they can cause problems on my aircraft. This has nothing to do with anything except your attitude and your refusal to follow reasonable instructions from airline personnel. Show me the reasonable instructions Zara challenged. Show me the regulation that allows you to move a passenger who has valid documentation and hasn't violated any conduct policies. Show me the legal authority that lets you decide my ticket isn't legitimate because you don't like how I look. Senator Brooks shifted in his seat, beginning to realize that this confrontation was heading in directions that might not be beneficial for his own reputation if it ended up being recorded and shared widely on social media. He had requested the seat upgrade as a personal favor, but he hadn't expected it to involve watching an airline captain berate a young woman based on obvious racial profiling. Listen here, Hawkins said, pointing his finger directly at Zara's face in a gesture that several passengers recognized as crossing the line from professional disagreement to personal attack. I don't know what credit card you stole to buy this ticket, or what computer system you hacked to get yourself upgraded, but I guarantee you that you are not flying in my first-class cabin tonight. The accusation of criminal activity hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, and every passenger in the first-class section understood that they had just witnessed something that crossed every line of professional conduct and basic human decency. Carmen gasped audibly from the galley, her hand flying to cover her mouth, as she realized her captain had just accused a paying customer of credit card fraud without any evidence whatsoever. James Park's live stream exploded with comments as viewers reacted to what they were seeing, with thousands of people sharing the stream and demanding answers about why an airline captain was being allowed to treat a passenger this way. The hashtag #SkyVistaScandal began trending within minutes as the confrontation reached audiences far beyond the aircraft itself. Captain Hawkins' Zara said, and now her voice carried a tone that made several passengers lean forward because they recognized the sound of someone who was about to deliver consequences that couldn't be taken back. I strongly suggest you check my passenger profile notes one more time, and I recommend you consider very carefully what you say next, because this conversation is being recorded by multiple people and is currently being broadcast live to thousands of viewers. I don't care who's recording what Hawkins shot back, his judgment clouded by anger and embarrassment at being challenged so publicly. And I don't care what notes are in some computer system. I know what I see, and what I see is someone who doesn't belong in first class trying to scam their way into accommodations they can't afford. Mrs. Patterson, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up from her seat with the kind of crisp British accent that commanded attention. Captain, she said firmly, I have been flying internationally for 40 years, and I have never witnessed such appalling behavior from airline personnel. This young woman has done nothing except sit quietly in a seat she legitimately purchased. Ma'am Hawkins replied, spinning toward Mrs. Patterson with obvious irritation at having another passenger question his judgment. I appreciate your concern, but this is a security and operational matter that requires captain's discretion. I'm handling this situation according to established protocols. What protocols? Zara asked, standing up from her seat for the first time since the confrontation began. She wasn't particularly tall, but she carried herself with the kind of posture that commanded attention and suggested someone who was accustomed to being taken seriously in high-stakes situations. The protocol that gives me absolute authority over passenger placement and behavior on this aircraft, Hawkins replied, stepping closer to her in what was clearly intended to be an intimidating gesture. And what about the protocols regarding passenger rights and anti-discrimination policies? Zara asked, maintaining eye contact without backing down, despite the fact that Hawkins was now invading her personal space in a way that made other passengers visibly uncomfortable. You want to talk about discrimination? Hawkins said, his voice becoming louder and more aggressive. I'll tell you what's discriminatory. It's discriminatory when someone like you thinks they can buy their way into spaces where they don't belong, and then play the victim when real passengers object to your presence. The words hit the cabin like a physical blow, and several passengers inhaled sharply as they realized Hawkins had just said something that could never be taken back or explained away as a misunderstanding. James Park's live stream viewer count had exploded to over 50,000 people, with comments flooding in so fast they were impossible to read. But the general sentiment was clear. Viewers around the world were watching an airline captain destroy his career in real time, and they were sharing the experience with everyone they knew. Senator Brooks finally realized that his request for a better seat was about to become the least important aspect of a situation that was spiraling completely out of control, and that his own reputation could be severely damaged if he appeared to be endorsing Hawkins' behavior through his continued presence and silence. Arthur the senator said, rising from his seat with obvious discomfort, "Perhaps we should take a step back here and find a solution that works for everyone involved." Hawkins turned toward the senator with desperation in his eyes, clearly hoping for support from someone whose opinion carried weight in the political circles where airline executives needed to maintain relationships. "Senator, you understand the importance of maintaining order and appropriate standards on commercial aircraft?" he said. "Passengers need to respect the authority of flight crews and accept reasonable accommodation adjustments when operational requirements demand it." "What I understand," Senator Brooks replied carefully, "is that this young woman appears to have valid documentation for her seat, and I'm not comfortable with the direction this conversation has taken." The senator's withdrawal of support hit Hawkins like cold water, forcing him to realize that his powerful ally had just abandoned him rather than risk being associated with what was clearly becoming a public relations disaster of massive proportions. "Fine," Hawkins said, turning back to Zara with renewed determination born of desperation. "If that's how everyone wants to play this, then we'll do it by the book." "Miss," he said, his voice dripping with contempt, "you are creating a disturbance on this aircraft and interfering with normal flight operations. I am ordering you as captain of this vessel to gather your belongings and move to alternative seating in the economy section." "I'm not creating any disturbance," Zara replied calmly. "I'm sitting quietly in a seat I paid for while you're the one shouting and making accusations. If anyone is disrupting this flight, Captain, it's you." "That's it." Hawkins snarled, his face now flushed to a deep red that suggested someone whose blood pressure had reached dangerous levels. "I've had enough of your attitude and your disrespect for authority. Security is going to escort you off this aircraft, and you can explain your sob story to the gate agents." "On what grounds?" Zara asked, her voice remaining level despite the escalation. "Unruly passenger behavior and refusal to follow crew instructions," Hawkins replied immediately, as if he had been waiting for the question. "Plus suspicious circumstances regarding ticket validity that require investigation by airport security." Carmen Rodriguez, who had been watching the exchange with growing horror, finally found her voice and stepped forward from the galley area. "Captain," she said, her voice shaking, but determined this passenger hasn't violated any conduct policies. "She's been polite and compliant throughout the entire interaction," Carmen Hawkins said, spinning toward his flight attendant with fury. "You are overstepping your authority and interfering with Captain's prerogative regarding passenger management. Return to your duties and let me handle this situation." "I can't watch you do this," Carmen replied, surprising herself with her own courage. "This is wrong, and everyone on this plane knows it's wrong." The support from his own crew member clearly rattled Hawkins, who was now facing opposition from passengers, his flight attendant, and even the senator who had originally requested the seat. He was backed into a corner with nowhere to retreat except deeper into the position he had already taken. "Listen to me very carefully," Hawkins said, turning back to Zara and lowering his voice to what he imagined was a menacing whisper, though the cabin was quiet enough that every word carried to the back rows. "You are going to take your little attitude and your fake ticket and get off my aircraft, or I'm going to have you dragged off in handcuffs," Captain Hawkins Zara said, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile, and it didn't reach her eyes. It was the kind of smile that successful predators wore when they realized their prey had just walked into a trap. "You are making the biggest mistake of your career, and you have no idea who you're dealing with." "I know exactly what you are," Hawkins shot back, his voice rising again as he felt control of the situation slipping away, despite his attempts to assert dominance through increasingly aggressive tactics. "You're some affirmative action princess who thinks she can buy her way into the big leagues and demand to be treated like she actually belongs here." The words hung in the cabin air like toxic gas, and several passengers actually pushed back in their seats as if they could distance themselves from the ugliness they had just witnessed. Mrs. Patterson's phone continued recording everything, capturing not just Hawkins' words, but also the shocked expressions of other travelers, who were realizing they were witnessing something that would have consequences far beyond this single flight. "You think you can talk to me like I'm your equal?" Hawkins continued his judgment, completely clouded by anger and wounded pride. "I'm a captain with 30 years of experience flying international routes. I've been personally commended by airline executives and government officials. You're nobody wearing clothes that probably came from a thrift store, trying to pretend you belong in accommodations that cost more than you make in 6 months," Captain Zara said quietly, and there was something in her tone that made everyone in the cabin lean forward, because they sensed that whatever came next was going to change everything about this confrontation. "I'm not your equal," she continued, her voice becoming colder with each word. "I'm your boss." The statement hit the cabin like an explosion, followed by a silence so complete that the only sound was the gentle hum of the aircraft's environmental systems and the distant noise of ground equipment moving around the tarmac outside. Hawkins stared at her for several long seconds, his mind clearly struggling to process what he had just heard, and whether it could possibly be anything other than the desperate bluff of someone who had been backed into a corner with nowhere left to retreat. "My boss?" he repeated, and then he began to laugh. It was an ugly sound, harsh and disbelieving, the kind of laughter that people used when they heard something so absurd that they couldn't process it as anything other than a joke. "Did everyone hear that? She thinks she's my boss." He turned to address the other passengers, gesturing toward Zara as if she were an exhibit in some kind of circus. "This young lady apparently believes that she's in charge of Skyvista Airlines. I suppose next she'll be telling us she owns the aircraft." "I didn't say I was the CEO," Zara corrected quietly. "I said I own the CEO." The cryptic clarification only served to fuel Hawkins' sense of righteousness and his conviction that he was dealing with someone who had clearly lost touch with reality under the pressure of being caught in whatever scam she was attempting to pull off. The idea that this young woman in a college hoodie could have any kind of authority over anyone, much less him, was so absurd that it only reinforced his determination to put her back in what he considered her proper place. "You own the CEO," Hawkins repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm and disbelief. "Of course you do. And I suppose you also own the aircraft and the airport and probably the entire aviation industry while we're at it." Senator Brooks shifted uncomfortably in his seat, realizing that his association with this situation was becoming more problematic by the moment, and that his best option was probably to distance himself from Hawkins as quickly and clearly as possible. Arthur the Senator said, his voice carrying a warning tone. "I think this has gone far enough. Perhaps we should just proceed with the flight as originally planned and sort out any seating issues once we're in the air." But Hawkins was beyond hearing reasonable suggestions from anyone, including powerful political figures whose opinions he would normally value above almost everything else. He had been challenged and humiliated in public, and his only path forward was to decisively demonstrate his authority and prove that young women who didn't know their place couldn't intimidate him with wild claims and entitled attitudes. "No, Senator Hawkins," said firmly, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had made a final decision and would not be swayed by additional input. "This passenger has been disruptive, disrespectful, and delusional. She's made false claims about her identity, refused to follow lawful crew instructions, and created a security concern that needs to be addressed before we can safely operate this flight." Carmen Rodriguez watched the situation continue to escalate beyond anything she had ever seen in 15 years of commercial aviation, and she realized that her captain was heading toward a point of no return that would destroy not only his career, but potentially the reputation of everyone associated with this flight. "Captain," she said, stepping closer to the confrontation despite her fear of becoming a target for his anger. "Please, this passenger hasn't done anything wrong. She's been sitting quietly in her assigned seat, and she has valid documentation. I really think we should consider alternative approaches to resolving this situation." Carmen Hawkins snapped, turning toward her with fury that made her take an involuntary step backward. "I have given you a direct order to return to your duties and stop interfering with my management of this passenger issue. If you continue to undermine my authority, I will have you written up for insubordination." The threat against his own crew member for defending a passenger's rights pushed the situation into territory that even the most conflict-averse travelers could recognize as completely inappropriate, and James Park's live-stream comments exploded with viewers demanding that someone intervene to stop what appeared to be a complete breakdown of professional standards and basic human decency. Hawkins turned back to Zara, who had remained seated throughout the entire exchange, watching him with the kind of calm observation that suggested someone evaluating a specimen under laboratory conditions, rather than someone feeling threatened or intimidated by his aggressive behavior. "Last warning," Hawkins said, leaning over her seat in a gesture that was clearly intended to be physically intimidating. "Get your belongings and walk off this aircraft under your own power, or I will have you removed by force and arrested for interfering with flight operations." Zara looked up at him from her seat, meeting his eyes with steady gaze that showed no fear, no uncertainty, and no intention of backing down from the position she had taken. "Try it," she said quietly. The two words carried more weight than all of Hawkins' threats and bluster combined, and several passengers later said they could actually feel the atmospheric pressure in the cabin change as the confrontation reached its breaking point. Hawkins stared down at her for several long seconds, his breathing becoming heavier as he processed the fact that this young woman was not going to be intimidated by his authority, his threats, or his attempts to humiliate her into compliance. She was calling his bluff, and he was faced with the choice of either backing down in front of everyone who was watching or following through on threats that would have consequences he couldn't predict or control. His hand moved before his conscious mind had fully processed the decision to escalate to physical contact. He didn't grab her arm this time, didn't try to pull her from the seat. Instead, he drew his hand back and swung his open palm in an arc that ended with a sharp crack against Zara's left cheek. The sound of the slap echoed through the first-class cabin, like a gunshot, followed immediately by a collective gasp from every passenger who witnessed the assault. Carmen screamed, her hand flying to cover her mouth in shock and horror. Mrs. Patterson's phone captured every detail of the impact and its aftermath. James Park's live-stream audience exploded into outrage as 50,000 viewers watched an airline captain strike a passenger who had done nothing except refuse to give up a seat she had legally purchased. Zara's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow, her cheek instantly beginning to redden and swell from the impact. For several seconds, she remained frozen in that position, her face turned away from Hawkins while she processed what had just happened and what it meant for everything that would follow. When she slowly turned her head back to face him, there was blood on her lip where the impact had caused her teeth to cut the inside of her mouth. Her left cheek was already showing the dark red marks that would soon become bruising, and her eye was beginning to water from the shock of being struck. But her expression had changed completely. The calm observation was gone, replaced by something that made Hawkins take an involuntary step backward, despite his attempts to maintain his dominant position. It was the look of someone who had just been handed exactly the weapon they needed to destroy their enemy completely and permanently. That she said quietly, her voice steady despite the blood on her lip, is what happens when you disobey the captain. But Zara wasn't looking at him with fear or submission. She was looking at him with the cold calculation of someone who had just watched their opponent make a mistake so catastrophic that the only question remaining was how complete their destruction would be. She reached up and touched her lip, examining the blood on her fingertip with the kind of detached interest that someone might show when discovering evidence that would be useful in court proceedings. "Carmen," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence of the cabin, "could you please pick up my phone?" Carmen Rodriguez moved as if she were walking through deep water, her movements slow and deliberate as she processed what she had just witnessed and tried to understand how a routine passenger interaction had escalated to physical violence in the space of less than 10 minutes. Her hands were shaking as she retrieved Zara's phone from where it had fallen during the confrontation, and she could feel the eyes of every passenger in the first-class cabin tracking her movements. The flight attendant had witnessed difficult passengers before, had seen captains make questionable decisions under pressure, had even dealt with situations where travelers became aggressive or uncooperative after consuming too much alcohol in airport lounges. But she had never seen anything like this, had never imagined that someone in Hawkins' position would cross the line from verbal intimidation to actual physical assault against a passenger who had done nothing except refuse to surrender a seat she had rightfully purchased. "Thank you," Zara said, as Carmen handed her the phone, her voice maintaining the same eerily calm tone that she had used throughout the entire confrontation, as if being slapped by an airline captain was merely an inconvenience to be dealt with, rather than a shocking assault that had left everyone else in the cabin struggling to process what they had witnessed. Zara unlocked her phone's screen and navigated to an application that looked like a standard contact management system, but the interface was sleek black and gold rather than the typical blue and white color scheme that most people would recognize. She scrolled through a list of names and numbers, stopping at a contact that was simply labeled Chen. CEO emergency. The cabin remained completely silent except for the ambient sounds of the aircraft's environmental systems and the distant noise of ground operations continuing outside, as if the rest of the world was proceeding normally, while the people inside this metal tube dealt with a situation that would have consequences reaching far beyond any individual flight or airline route. James Park's live stream had become the fastest-growing viral event of the day, with viewer counts approaching 100,000 people and climbing exponentially as word spread through social media about what was happening aboard SkyVista Flight 447. Comments were flooding in faster than anyone could read. But the sentiment was universally clear. Viewers around the world were witnessing something unprecedented and demanding that someone take action to address what appeared to be a complete breakdown of corporate accountability and basic human decency. Hawkins stood near the galley area, his face still flushed red from the adrenaline of physical confrontation, watching Zara's phone call preparation with the kind of nervous energy that suggested someone who was beginning to realize that his actions might have consequences he hadn't fully considered when he decided to escalate the situation to violence. Zara pressed the contact name and held the phone to her ear, and the cabin was so quiet that the ringing tone was audible to passengers several rows away. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and then a voice answered that was clearly being broadcast on speaker mode rather than being contained to the phone's earpiece. "Chen here," said a deep voice that carried the tone of someone accustomed to receiving urgent calls at unusual hours. "Zara, is that you? We weren't expecting to hear from you until you landed in London. Is everything proceeding according to schedule?" The voice belonged to Richard Chen, CEO of SkyVista Airlines, and while most of the passengers wouldn't have recognized his name or voice, Hawkins clearly did. The color drained from his face as he realized that the young woman he had just assaulted was apparently on a first-name basis with the most powerful executive in the company. Mr. Chen Zara said, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin because she had deliberately activated the phone's speaker function to ensure that everyone present could hear both sides of the conversation. I'm currently on Flight 447, and I'm calling to report a serious incident that requires your immediate attention. Of course, Chen replied, his voice taking on a more formal tone as he switched from casual greeting to corporate crisis management mode. What kind of incident are we dealing with? Technical malfunction, weather delay, security concern. Captain Derek Hawkins just slapped me in the face, Zara said, and her words fell into the cabin atmosphere like stones dropping into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond their immediate impact. The silence that followed was so complete and so profound that it felt like the air itself had been sucked out of the cabin, leaving everyone present struggling to breathe normally while they processed what they had just heard and tried to understand what it meant for everyone involved. He did what Chen's voice came through the speaker with the kind of shocked disbelief that suggested someone who couldn't process information that contradicted everything he thought he understood about his company and his employees. Captain Derek Hawkins physically struck me because I refused to give up my first-class seat to Senator William Brooks. Zara continued, her voice remaining steady and professional, despite the visible swelling on her cheek and the blood that was still visible on her lip. He accused me of credit card fraud, computer hacking, and various other criminal activities because he decided that I didn't belong in Seat 1A based on my appearance and his personal assumptions about who I am. Zara Chen's voice was trembling now, and passengers could hear the sound of papers rustling and office doors slamming as the CEO clearly began mobilizing resources to address what he was learning. Please tell me this is some kind of misunderstanding. Please tell me that Captain Hawkins didn't actually put his hands on you. I wish I could, Zara replied, touching her swollen cheek with deliberate emphasis for the benefit of everyone who was watching. But this entire incident has been recorded by multiple passengers and is currently being live-streamed to approximately 100,000 viewers on social media platforms. Hawkins felt his knees begin to buckle as the full magnitude of what he had done began to penetrate through his anger and ego to reach the part of his brain that understood consequences and career implications. Richard Chen wasn't just any CEO. He was the man who controlled every aspect of Hawkins's professional life, from his flight assignments to his pension benefits to his ability to work anywhere in the commercial aviation industry. Captain Hawkins Chen's voice became sharper and more focused, taking on the tone of someone who had shifted from shocked disbelief to corporate damage control mode. Are you present? Are you listening to this conversation? Yes, sir. Hawkins managed to croak, his voice barely audible, as he realized that the phone call was about to determine whether he had any future in aviation or any hope of salvaging the career he had spent 3 decades building. Did you strike this passenger? Chen asked his question, cutting through the cabin noise with surgical precision. Hawkins opened his mouth to respond, perhaps to offer explanations or justifications or contextual details that might somehow mitigate what had happened. But no words came out, because he realized that no explanation could possibly justify what thousands of people had already witnessed, and what would soon be seen by millions more. Mr. Chen Zara said before Hawkins could formulate any response, I need you to ground this aircraft immediately. Cancel the flight. Nobody leaves this aircraft until the proper authorities have been contacted and appropriate action has been taken. Already in progress, Chen replied, and passengers could hear keyboard clicking and multiple phone lines ringing in the background as the CEO's office became a crisis management command center. I'm contacting the tower now to revoke departure clearance, and I'm personally coming to the aircraft to address this situation. The portable stairs rolled up to the aircraft with mechanical precision, while Hawkins stood near the cockpit door watching through the small porthole windows as a convoy of black vehicles approached across the tarmac. His face had shifted from red to pale gray as the reality of his situation continued to settle into his consciousness like cold water filling his lungs. 3 Port Authority police cruisers led the convoy, their red and blue lights creating a strobe effect that was visible even through the cabin's tinted windows. Behind them came an unmarked black sedan that Hawkins recognized immediately. Sky Vista Executive Transport Vehicle Number 1, reserved exclusively for CEO Richard Chen and used only during the most serious corporate emergencies. James Park's livestream had become a global phenomenon, with major news outlets beginning to pick up the story and rebroadcast portions of the footage to their own audiences. The hashtag #SkyVista Assault was trending worldwide, and aviation industry analysts were already speculating about the legal and financial implications for the airline's reputation and stock price. Senator Brooks had retreated to his seat in 4B and was staring intensely at his phone, apparently receiving urgent communications from his staff about the political implications of being associated with what was rapidly becoming an international scandal. Mrs. Patterson continued recording everything with the kind of methodical precision that suggested someone who understood the historical significance of what she was documenting. The cabin door opened to admit 2 Port Authority officers, followed immediately by a man in an expensive Italian suit whose tie was slightly askew and whose forehead showed beads of sweat despite the cool air circulation in the terminal area. Richard Chen looked like someone who had been pulled away from something important to deal with a crisis he couldn't have imagined in his worst nightmares. Chen's eyes swept across the first-class cabin, taking in the scene of passengers with phones and cameras, flight attendants standing nervously near the galley, and Captain Hawkins looking like a condemned man awaiting execution. But his attention focused immediately on Seat 1A, where Zara sat with obvious facial injuries that made Chen's expression shift from corporate concern to personal horror. To the complete shock of everyone present, including the police officers who had expected to deal with a routine passenger disturbance, Chen walked directly to Zara's seat and dropped to one knee beside her chair, placing himself in a position of submission that made it clear to everyone watching that this was not a CEO addressing a difficult customer. Ms. Mitchell Chen said, his voice barely above a whisper as he examined the bruising on her face. "I am personally devastated by what has happened to you on our aircraft. I have no words that can adequately express how completely this situation contradicts everything our company claims to stand for." The use of formal address and the obvious deference in Chen's tone sent shockwaves through the cabin as passengers realized they were witnessing something that fundamentally changed their understanding of who Zara was and what her relationship to the airline might actually be. "Hello, Richard." Zara replied, her voice carrying the tone of someone addressing a business associate rather than someone she had never met before. "You made excellent time getting here." "I was in a board meeting when you called," Chen explained, still kneeling beside her seat like a subordinate reporting to a superior. "I left immediately and drove here personally because this situation requires the highest level of attention our company can provide." Hawkins watched this exchange with growing confusion and dawning horror as he began to understand that whatever relationship existed between the young woman he had assaulted and the CEO of his airline was far more significant than he had imagined possible. "Richard," Zara said, gesturing toward her swollen cheek. "Captain Hawkins accused me of credit card fraud, suggested I had hacked computer systems to obtain my seat assignment, and ultimately struck me when I refused to surrender accommodations I had legitimately purchased." Chen stood slowly and turned toward Hawkins with an expression that combined professional fury with personal outrage in ways that made the captain take an involuntary step backward toward the cockpit door. Captain Hawkins Chen said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled authority that suggested someone who was accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of people and millions of dollars. "Did you physically assault this passenger?" Sir Hawkins began, his voice cracking as he tried to formulate some explanation that might salvage his position. "There was a seating dispute, and the passenger became uncooperative when I tried to resolve the situation according to standard protocols. That's not what I asked you, Chen interrupted, his voice becoming sharper. I asked whether you struck this passenger with your hand. The question hung in the cabin air, while passengers held their breath, waiting for an answer that everyone already knew, but needed to hear spoken aloud for the official record. There was a situation that required decisive action, Hawkins said, avoiding direct admission while trying to maintain some semblance of justification for his behavior. Officers, Chen said, turning toward the Port Authority police, without waiting for any further explanation from Hawkins. I want this man arrested immediately for assault and battery. I also want to file charges on behalf of Sky Vista Airlines for conduct that brings disrepute to our company and endangers our operational certification. Sir, one of the officers said, approaching Hawkins with handcuffs ready, you're under arrest for assault in the 3rd degree. You have the right to remain silent, and anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. As the handcuffs clicked into place around Hawkins' wrists, he looked back toward Zara with desperation in his eyes, finally understanding that he was dealing with someone whose power and influence he had completely misjudged. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice broken by the reality of watching his career and his life collapse in the space of minutes. Zara stood up from her seat for the first time since Chen had arrived, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the cabin and across the live stream to the hundreds of thousands of people who were watching this moment unfold in real time. "I'm the owner of Sky Vista Airlines," she said, letting the words settle into the silence like stones dropping into deep water. "And you just committed assault against your boss on live television." The aftermath of Zara's revelation created a moment of complete suspension, as if everyone in the first-class cabin needed time to process information that fundamentally changed their understanding of everything they had witnessed over the past hour. James Park's livestream comments exploded with viewers trying to verify what they had just heard, while Mrs. Patterson's aristocratic composure finally cracked as she realized she had been documenting something far more significant than a simple passenger dispute. Senator Brooks stared at Zara with the kind of expression usually reserved for people who had just learned that someone they had dismissed as unimportant was actually in a position to either help or destroy their political careers. The realization that he had watched someone assault a billionaire airline owner without speaking up was clearly causing him to recalculate every aspect of his involvement in the evening's events. Carmen Rodriguez felt her knees go weak as she understood that she had been serving the actual owner of the airline while watching her captain treat that same owner like a criminal who didn't deserve basic human dignity. The fact that she had ultimately defended Zara against Hawkins's aggression suddenly took on much greater significance in terms of her own career prospects and professional future. Captain Hawkins stood between the two police officers with his wrists secured behind his back, staring at Zara as if he could somehow change what had happened through the sheer intensity of his regret and disbelief. The uniform that had represented his authority and status for 30 years now felt like a costume from a play that had ended badly, leaving him exposed and powerless in front of people who had every reason to ensure his complete professional destruction. Richard, Zara said, turning toward Chen with the kind of businesslike tone that suggested someone transitioning from personal crisis management to corporate restructuring priorities. "I assume you'll need to brief the board about this incident and its implications for company operations and reputation management." "The board is already in emergency session," Chen replied, pulling out his phone to show her a screen filled with missed calls and urgent message notifications. "Our stock price has dropped 12% in the last hour as word about this incident spread through social media and financial news networks." Zara nodded with the kind of calm acceptance that suggested someone who had anticipated exactly this type of consequence and had already begun formulating strategies to address the broader implications. "We'll need to move quickly to control the narrative and demonstrate that this was an isolated incident involving one individual, rather than a reflection of institutional culture or training policies." The clinical discussion of crisis management and corporate damage control conducted while Hawkins stood in handcuffs just a few feet away drove home the magnitude of what he had done and the level of power he had chosen to challenge through his actions. "Ma'am," said the senior Port Authority officer, "we'll need to complete some paperwork and get official statements from witnesses before we transport the suspect to booking and processing." "Of course," Zara replied. "Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Park, I assume you'd be willing to provide witness statements about what you observed this evening, Mrs." Patterson, who had maintained her composure throughout even the most shocking moments of the confrontation, finally allowed her aristocratic mask to slip slightly as she processed the full implications of what she had witnessed and recorded. "Young lady," she said, her British accent making her words sound even more formal and significant, "I have traveled extensively for over 40 years, and I can say without reservation that what I witnessed tonight was the most appalling display of prejudice and abuse of authority I have ever seen from commercial airline personnel." James Park was frantically trying to manage his live stream while processing the fact that his routine travel content had accidentally captured what was already being called the most significant aviation scandal in recent history. "This whole thing is recorded," he said, holding up his phone. "Everything from the moment Captain Hawkins first approached you until right now. The entire conversation, the assault, all of it. My audience has grown to over 300,000 people, and the video is being shared everywhere." The mention of the growing global audience reminded everyone present that this incident had moved far beyond the confines of the aircraft itself and was rapidly becoming an international news event with implications that would extend far beyond any individual career or corporate crisis. "Officers," Zara said, "I want to press full charges against Captain Hawkins for assault, and I want the district attorney's office to understand that Sky Vista Airlines will cooperate completely with any investigation into this matter." Hawkins finally found his voice as the reality of his situation penetrated through his shock and disbelief. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice barely audible as he struggled to speak through what appeared to be genuine remorse mixed with desperate self-preservation instincts, "I made a terrible mistake. I let my temper and my pride override my judgment, and I deeply regret what happened here tonight." "Captain Hawkins," Zara replied, her voice carrying no anger but also no forgiveness, just the kind of cold professional assessment that someone might use when discussing a business decision that needed to be made efficiently and permanently. "Your regret doesn't change what you did, and it doesn't address the fact that your actions tonight revealed attitudes and behaviors that have probably been affecting passengers for years without consequence, because those passengers didn't have the resources or platform to demand accountability." The observation hit Hawkins like a physical blow, as he realized that Zara understood exactly what his assault represented in terms of broader patterns of discrimination and abuse of authority that had been hidden behind the closed doors of commercial aircraft and the unquestioned authority of airline personnel. As the Port Authority officers prepared to escort Hawkins off the aircraft, Chen turned to address the remaining passengers with the kind of formal statement that suggested someone who had shifted completely into corporate crisis management mode. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin on behalf of Sky Vista Airlines, "I want to apologize for the completely unacceptable behavior you witnessed tonight. This incident does not represent our company values or training standards, and we will be conducting a complete investigation to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again." The replacement captain who took over Flight 447's controls was Jean-Luc Dubois, a soft-spoken French pilot who had been enjoying a layover at the crew hotel when Chen's emergency call pulled him back to the airport to salvage what remained of the evening's flight schedule. Dubois had 25 years of international flying experience and had never been asked to take over an aircraft under circumstances quite like these. As the Boeing 777 finally lifted off from JFK, nearly 3 hours behind its original schedule, Zara sat in her first-class seat with an ice pack pressed against her swollen cheek, using her laptop to review email communications that had been flooding in from lawyers, board members, media outlets, and aviation regulators who had learned about the incident through social media coverage. Carmen Rodriguez approached her seat with obvious nervousness, carrying a cup of tea and wearing the expression of someone who needed to share information, but wasn't sure how it would be received. Ms. Mitchell Carmen said quietly, glancing around to ensure their conversation wouldn't be overheard by other passengers. "There's something I think you should know about Captain Hawkins and this particular route." Zara looked up from her laptop, with immediate interest setting aside her correspondence to focus completely on what Carmen was about to reveal. "This flight, JFK to Heathrow every Tuesday and Friday." Carmen continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Hawkins always bid for these specific assignments, and he was always very particular about certain operational procedures that didn't quite make sense to the rest of us." What kind of procedures? Zara asked, though she suspected she already knew where this conversation was heading based on patterns she had observed in other corporate investigations. "The catering," Carmen said, looking around nervously again. "Every time Hawkins flew this route, we would load special galley carts that were marked as VIP reserves for the return leg. Heavy metal containers that we were specifically instructed never to open or inspect." Zara felt a familiar sensation in her stomach, the same instinct that had guided her through dozens of corporate acquisitions and had taught her to recognize when surface problems indicated much deeper systemic issues that required investigation. "How heavy?" she asked. "Heavy enough that the ground crew always complained about loading them," Carmen replied. "And Captain Hawkins would always argue with the fuel planning department, insisting we needed to carry more fuel than the flight plan called for." The pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place in Zara's mind as she realized that the assault against her might have been motivated by more than simple prejudice and ego. Hawkins hadn't just been angry about being challenged by someone he thought didn't belong in first class. He had been stressed about having an unexpected observer positioned directly next to the galley area where his suspicious cargo operations were being conducted. Carmen, Zara said, pulling up the flight's cargo manifest on her laptop. "Do you remember the name of a flight attendant named Jessica who was fired about 6 months ago?" Carmen's eyes widened with surprise and recognition. "Jessica Martinez," she said immediately. "She was terminated for alleged theft, but none of us believed she would actually steal anything. She was one of the most honest people I've ever worked with." "What happened to her?" Zara asked, though she was already beginning to formulate theories about how Jessica's termination connected to Hawkins' cargo irregularities. "She tried to open one of the VIP carts during service because we had run out of premium liquor for first-class passengers," Carmen explained. "Captain Hawkins found her in the galley and absolutely lost his mind, screaming at her so loudly that passengers in business class could hear him through the cabin walls." Zara's laptop showed her the current flight's weight distribution data, which she was able to access through her owner-level security clearances in the airline's operational systems. The numbers confirmed what Carmen was describing. The aircraft was carrying approximately 2,500 pounds of cargo that wasn't properly documented in the passenger manifest. Carmen, Zara said, her voice taking on the focused intensity that her business associates recognized as a signal that she was shifting into investigation mode. "I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it without asking questions or discussing it with anyone else." "Of course, Ms. Mitchell," Carmen replied, understanding that her cooperation in this moment could determine her entire future with the company. "I want you to check the galley carts that Captain Hawkins was so protective of," Zara said. "But I want you to be very careful, and I want you to document everything you find with your phone before you touch anything." Carmen nodded and moved toward the galley area, leaving Zara alone with her laptop and the growing realization that Hawkins' assault against her had been the tip of an iceberg that probably extended deep into the airline's operational structure and possibly involved other employees in both New York and London. She opened a secure messaging application and began composing communications to her legal team, her forensic accounting specialists, and her contacts within federal law enforcement agencies that investigated aviation-related crimes. If Hawkins had been using Skyvista aircraft for cargo smuggling operations, then tonight's assault had accidentally exposed criminal activity that would require much more serious intervention than simple employment termination. 20 minutes later, Carmen returned to her seat with obvious excitement and nervousness, holding her phone in a way that suggested she had captured photographic evidence of whatever she had discovered in the galley. Ms. Mitchell Carmen whispered those VIP cards that Captain Hawkins was so protective of. They're completely empty. Whatever was supposed to be in them has been removed. Heathrow Airport materialized through the aircraft windows as a sprawling maze of lights and movement. One of the world's busiest transportation hubs, processing millions of passengers and countless tons of cargo every day. Through a complex network of terminals, runways, and support facilities that operated around the clock without pause. Instead of proceeding to the bright, modern passenger terminal where arriving travelers would normally disembark, Captain Dubois followed air traffic control instructions to taxi toward a remote cargo area on the far side of the airfield, away from the main terminal buildings and the normal flow of commercial passenger operations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dubois announced over the cabin intercom system, "due to a minor technical indication with our aircraft systems, we've been directed to a remote parking position for a brief safety inspection. Transportation will be provided to the terminal building, and we apologize for any inconvenience this may cause." The passengers accepted this explanation with the kind of resigned patience that experienced travelers develop after years of dealing with airline operational irregularities. But Zara knew the real reason for the remote parking was much more strategic than any technical inspection. During the flight, she had contacted UK Border Force and Customs authorities through encrypted communication channels, providing them with preliminary information about suspected cargo irregularities and requesting that they be prepared to conduct a thorough inspection of the aircraft upon arrival. The remote parking position would allow that inspection to proceed without disrupting normal terminal operations or alerting any ground personnel who might be connected to Hawkins' smuggling activities. As soon as the engines spooled down and the aircraft came to a complete stop, Zara could see through the cabin windows that their arrival was being met by more than the usual ground service vehicles. 3 unmarked vans had positioned themselves near the aircraft, along with several official vehicles bearing the insignia of UK Customs Enforcement and airport security. More interesting to her investigation was the convoy of civilian vehicles that had arrived ahead of the official inspection team, 2 black Range Rovers and a large white cargo van that looked exactly like the type of vehicle that would be used for moving heavy, valuable items without attracting the attention of casual observers. A man in an expensive trench coat stepped out of the lead Range Rover and began walking toward the aircraft with obvious agitation, gesturing angrily at his mobile phone and apparently conducting heated conversations with people who weren't present on the tarmac. Even from a distance, Zara could see that this man's body language suggested someone whose carefully planned operation had been disrupted by unexpected complications, and she suspected she was looking at Simon Caldwell, the London operations manager, whose background check had revealed previous employment with a shipping company that had been shut down for customs violations. Carmen Zara said, "I need you to open the forward service door, but I don't want you to deploy the stairs yet. I'm going down to the tarmac." Carmen looked confused and concerned about safety protocols and passenger procedures, but she also understood that normal rules might not apply when the airline's owner was conducting what appeared to be a criminal investigation with the cooperation of federal law enforcement agencies. Zara had spent the latter part of the flight using her laptop's camera and specialized makeup techniques to enhance her facial bruising, making her injuries look more severe and more recent than they actually were. She pulled her Columbia University hoodie up over her head and adopted the posture of someone who was exhausted, injured, and probably not thinking clearly about the implications of what she was about to do. The portable stairs finally arrived and locked into position against the aircraft's door, providing access to the tarmac where Simon Caldwell was waiting with obvious impatience and growing anger about delays that were interfering with whatever schedule he had been expecting to maintain. Zara stepped out onto the metal platform at the top of the stairs, and the cold, damp London air immediately reminded her why she usually avoided traveling to England during the winter months. She hunched her shoulders against the chill and began walking slowly down the stairs, maintaining the appearance of someone who was probably suffering from shock and wasn't fully aware of her surroundings. Caldwell looked up as she descended, and his expression shifted from impatience to confusion as he clearly tried to understand why a young woman in casual clothing was the first person leaving an aircraft where he had been expecting to meet Captain Hawkins for their regular cargo transfer operation. "Who the hell are you?" Caldwell shouted over the noise of ground equipment and aircraft engines, his voice carrying the kind of aggressive tone that suggested someone whose patience had already been exhausted by unexpected complications. Zara reached the bottom of the stairs and stood facing him with the kind of uncertain body language that suggested someone who wasn't sure what she was supposed to do or say in this situation. "Captain Hawkins isn't coming," she said, pitching her voice to sound shaky and uncertain while delivering information that she knew would cause immediate panic in anyone who was depending on Hawkins for illegal cargo operations. Caldwell's face went white as he processed what she had said, and began to understand that his carefully coordinated smuggling operation was falling apart in ways he couldn't control or predict. "What do you mean he isn't coming?" Caldwell demanded, stepping closer to her with the kind of aggressive body language that was intended to intimidate someone he perceived as a potential threat to his operation. "He was arrested," Zara said, simply letting the words hit Caldwell like a physical blow, while she carefully observed his reaction to information that confirmed his involvement in whatever illegal activities Hawkins had been conducting. Simon Caldwell stared at Zara for several long seconds, his mind clearly struggling to process information that meant his entire operation was compromised, and that he needed to make immediate decisions about damage control and evidence elimination before law enforcement agencies could complete their investigation of the aircraft and its cargo. Arrested for what Caldwell asked, though his voice suggested that he was less interested in the specific charges than he was in understanding how much information might have been compromised and whether his own involvement in cargo smuggling activities had been exposed. "Assault," Zara replied, maintaining her persona as someone who was probably in shock and wasn't thinking clearly about the implications of what she was sharing. "He hit a passenger and there were witnesses. Everything was recorded." Caldwell's expression shifted from panic to calculation as he realized that if Hawkins had been arrested for simple assault rather than cargo smuggling, there might still be time to salvage the operation and eliminate evidence before investigators expanded their focus beyond passenger rights violations. "Listen," Caldwell said, pulling a thick roll of cash from his pocket and gesturing toward Zara with the kind of casual bribery that suggested someone who was accustomed to buying silence and cooperation from airline employees who might ask inconvenient questions. "I don't know what you think you saw or heard on that aircraft, but this is £5,000, and it's yours if you forget about whatever brought you down here and go catch the passenger bus with everyone else." Zara looked at the money in his hand, then back at his face, and her expression shifted subtly from confusion to something that might have been recognition or understanding. "I don't want your money, Mr. Caldwell," she said, using his name with the same deliberate precision she had used with the gate agent in New York, immediately alerting him to the fact that she knew far more about his identity and his operation than her appearance would suggest. "How do you know my name?" Caldwell demanded, his voice taking on a more dangerous edge as he began to understand that whatever was happening was much more complicated than a simple crew member who had stumbled into information she shouldn't possess. "The same way I know about the cargo irregularities, the falsified weight manifests, and the shell company accounts in the Cayman Islands that have been used to launder proceeds from your smuggling operation," Zara replied, and her voice had completely lost the uncertain, shaky quality she had been maintaining since leaving the aircraft. Caldwell's hand moved toward the inside of his coat, and Zara could see the outline of what appeared to be a weapon concealed beneath his clothing, but she didn't step back or show any of the fear that he was clearly trying to inspire. "Who are you?" Caldwell hissed his question, carrying genuine desperation, as he realized that his operation wasn't just compromised by bad luck or coincidence, but had been deliberately targeted by someone with access to information that should have been impossible for any ordinary passenger or crew member to obtain. "I'm the person who owns this aircraft," Mr. Caldwell, Zara said, pulling back her hoodie to reveal her face clearly for the first time since leaving the plane. "And I'm the person who called UK Border Force to inform them that you would be here tonight." At that moment, armed officers from the Metropolitan Police's Specialist Firearms Unit stepped out from positions where they had been concealed behind ground service vehicles and aircraft equipment, their weapons trained on Caldwell and his associates, while red laser targeting dots appeared on their chests like deadly Christmas decorations. Armed police shouted the lead officer, "Drop any weapons and place your hands where we can see them." Caldwell's pistol clattered to the concrete as he realized that his entire operation had been compromised from the beginning, and that the young woman he had tried to bribe and intimidate was actually the person responsible for orchestrating his capture and the destruction of everything he had built through years of careful smuggling operations. The white cargo van that had been positioned to receive whatever contraband Caldwell was expecting to transfer was immediately surrounded by customs officers who began documenting everything they found inside, while forensic accountants prepared to trace financial records that would expose the full extent of the international smuggling network that had been operating through Skyvista's London hub. Within hours, news outlets around the world were reporting not just on the assault incident that had started the investigation, but on the much larger story of how a single act of violence had accidentally exposed a criminal organization that had been using commercial aircraft to smuggle millions of dollars worth of contraband through some of the world's busiest airports without detection by traditional security measures. Zara stood on the tarmac watching Caldwell being loaded into a police transport vehicle, and she realized that tonight's events had given her much more than evidence of individual prejudice and poor training standards. She now had the information and legal leverage necessary to completely restructure her airline's operations, eliminate corruption that extended far beyond any single employee, and build an organizational culture that would serve as a model for the entire commercial aviation industry. 6 weeks after the incident aboard Flight 447, Derek Hawkins sat in a federal courthouse in Brooklyn wearing a standard orange jumpsuit instead of his captain's uniform, while prosecutors presented evidence to a jury that would determine not only his immediate legal fate, but also whether he would ever again be allowed to work in any capacity within the commercial aviation industry. The district attorney's office had expanded the charges far beyond simple assault, using the evidence that Zara's investigation had uncovered to build a comprehensive case that portrayed Hawkins as a central figure in an international smuggling operation that had used Skyvista aircraft to transport contraband worth tens of millions of dollars through customs checkpoints at major airports around the world. Zara sat in the front row of the courtroom's public gallery, her presence serving as a constant reminder to Hawkins of exactly how catastrophically his decision to assault her had backfired, destroying not only his career, but exposing criminal activities that had implicated dozens of other airline employees and ground operations personnel in both the United States and the United Kingdom. The prosecution's case was devastating in its thoroughness, incorporating not only the viral video footage of Hawkins striking Zara, but also financial records, cargo manifests, recorded communications between conspirators, and testimony from reformed participants in the smuggling operation who had agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for reduced sentences. Captain Hawkins, the lead prosecutor, said during her closing argument, believed that his uniform gave him the right to treat passengers as second-class citizens, based on nothing more than their appearance and his personal prejudices. But his assault on Ms. Mitchell wasn't just an isolated incident of workplace violence. It was the desperate action of someone who realized his criminal enterprise was being threatened by an observer he couldn't control or intimidate. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges, including assault, conspiracy to commit customs fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. Hawkins received a sentence of 8 years in federal prison, followed by a lifetime ban from any employment in commercial aviation or transportation security. Simon Caldwell, prosecuted simultaneously in UK courts, received an even harsher sentence after investigators discovered that his smuggling operation had been connected to organized crime networks that used airline routes to transport not only high-value contraband, but also materials that could potentially be used for terrorist activities. Senator William Brooks, who had been aboard Flight 447 and had witnessed the entire incident without intervening, found his political career effectively ended when video footage of his passive participation went viral during his re-election campaign. Voters in his home state made it clear that they would not tolerate representatives who stood by silently while airline personnel committed assault against passengers, regardless of the political party involved or other policy considerations. The financial settlements that emerged from civil litigation were substantial enough to fund comprehensive reforms across the entire commercial aviation industry, with particular emphasis on anti-discrimination training, passenger rights education, and whistleblower protection programs that would encourage employees to report suspicious activities without fear of retaliation. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the British socialite whose phone footage had provided crucial evidence for the prosecution, became an unexpected advocate for passenger rights and testified before parliamentary committees about the need for stronger oversight of airline personnel training and conduct standards. James Park's live stream footage was archived by the Smithsonian Institution as a historical document demonstrating how social media could be used to ensure accountability for corporate misconduct, and his accidental role in exposing the smuggling operation led to consulting opportunities with law enforcement agencies that were developing new techniques for detecting criminal activities in transportation networks. Carmen Rodriguez was promoted to chief flight attendant for SkyVista's international routes, with special responsibility for developing training programs that would ensure crew members understood both their authority and their obligations to treat all passengers with equal respect and dignity regardless of personal appearance or perceived social status. 8 months after the incident that had destroyed Derek Hawkins' life and exposed systemic corruption within SkyVista Airlines operations, Zara stood before a gathering of aviation industry executives, government regulators, and civil rights advocates to announce the launch of Phoenix Airways, a completely restructured airline built from the foundation of SkyVista's assets, but designed around principles of equality, transparency, and passenger dignity that would establish new standards for the entire commercial aviation industry. The rebranding was much more than cosmetic change or public relations gesture. It represented a fundamental restructuring of corporate culture, operational procedures, and employee training programs that addressed the root causes of the discrimination and criminal activity that had flourished under the previous management structure. The events aboard Flight 447 revealed problems that extended far beyond one individual's prejudice and poor judgment. Zara told the packed auditorium at the Phoenix Airways headquarters building, which had been completely renovated to include diversity and inclusion training centers, passenger advocacy offices, and employee whistleblower support services. They exposed institutional failures that allowed discrimination and criminal activity to persist for years without meaningful oversight or accountability. Phoenix Airways exists to prove that commercial aviation can and must do better. The new airline's operational policies included mandatory unconscious bias training for all personnel passenger advocacy representatives on every flight crew, real-time monitoring systems that tracked interactions between staff and customers to identify potential discrimination patterns and financial incentives that rewarded employees for demonstrating exceptional service to passengers from all backgrounds and economic circumstances. Captain Jean-Luc Dubois, who had taken over Flight 447 after Hawkins's arrest, was hired as Phoenix Airways' chief pilot and head of training operations with responsibility for developing educational programs that emphasized respectful passenger service as an essential component of aviation safety, rather than an optional courtesy that could be withheld based on personal preferences or prejudices. Carmen Rodriguez's promotion to chief flight attendant came with expanded authority to intervene in situations where passengers were being treated unfairly, and her training programs became models that were adopted by other airlines around the world, as industry leaders recognized the business benefits of ensuring that all customers felt welcomed and valued regardless of their appearance or perceived social status. The financial performance of Phoenix Airways exceeded all projections during its first year of operations, as passengers demonstrated their willingness to pay premium prices for airline service that guaranteed dignity and respect along with transportation from one destination to another. Customer satisfaction surveys consistently ranked Phoenix Airways as the industry leader in passenger experience, with particular praise for the airline's commitment to treating every traveler as a valued customer, deserving of professional courtesy and attention to their needs and concerns. The success of Phoenix Airways' business model inspired other carriers to implement similar reforms in their own operations, leading to industry-wide improvements in passenger treatment and a significant reduction in discrimination complaints filed with federal aviation authorities. Zara's personal story became a case study in business schools around the world, demonstrating how individual courage and strategic thinking could be used to transform entire industries and create lasting positive change that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances that had initially prompted action. The assault that had seemed like a career-ending catastrophe for Derek Hawkins had instead become the catalyst for reforms that protected millions of air travelers and ensured that commercial aviation would become more equitable, more transparent, and more accountable to the communities it served than it had ever been in its previous history. 18 months after the night that had changed everything, Zara walked through the first-class cabin of Phoenix Airways Flight 447, the same route number that had been retired from Sky Vista's schedule but had been restored as a symbol of transformation and renewal in the airline industry. She was dressed casually again, wearing dark jeans and a comfortable sweater that looked like they might have come from any department store, rather than the high-end boutiques where someone with her wealth would normally shop, because she had learned that her most important role as airline owner was to remain connected to the experiences of ordinary travelers, rather than isolating herself in the executive suite. The captain greeting passengers in the first-class cabin was Maria Rodriguez Carmen's younger sister, who had been inspired by the events aboard the original Flight 447 to pursue commercial aviation training, and had become Phoenix Airways' youngest female captain after completing an accelerated development program that Zara had personally sponsored. "Good evening, everyone," Captain Rodriguez announced as she moved through the cabin, making eye contact with each passenger and addressing them individually, rather than delivering the standard, impersonal pre-flight announcements that characterized most airline operations. "I'm Maria Rodriguez, your captain tonight, and I want to personally welcome each of you aboard Phoenix Airways." When she reached Zara's seat, Captain Rodriguez paused with a smile that suggested genuine pleasure at the opportunity to serve someone who had made her own career advancement possible through the reforms that had transformed the airline industry. "Ms. Mitchell," she said quietly, "it's an honor to have you aboard tonight. I hope you know how much your courage has meant to everyone who works in commercial aviation." Zara smiled back, appreciating both the recognition and the professional courtesy that had replaced the hostility and suspicion she had encountered on that same route when Derek Hawkins had been in command of the aircraft and had decided that her appearance made her unworthy of the service she had purchased. As the aircraft lifted off from JFK and climbed into the night sky above New York City, Zara looked out her window at the lights below and reflected on how much had changed since that terrible evening, when a single moment of violence had revealed corruption that extended throughout the airline industry and had demanded comprehensive reform rather than simple punishment for individual wrongdoing. The scar on her cheek had faded to a thin line that was barely visible under normal lighting conditions, but she occasionally touched it when she was thinking about the responsibilities that came with the power and influence she had gained through her business success. Every passenger on every Phoenix Airways flight deserved to know that they would be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance, their background, or their perceived social status. And that promise had become more than a corporate slogan. It had become a fundamental operating principle that influenced every aspect of the airline's culture and procedures. The story of Flight 447 had become a reminder that change was possible when individuals refused to accept injustice as the inevitable price of existing in systems that had been designed to benefit some people at the expense of others, and that courage could create ripple effects that extended far beyond anyone's ability to predict or control when they first decided to stand up for what was right. As the aircraft crossed into international airspace and began its journey toward London, Zara closed her eyes and allowed herself to feel satisfaction in knowing that no other passenger would ever again experience what she had endured that night. Because Phoenix Airways had proven that commercial aviation could operate with both profitability and principles, treating every customer as a valued human being, deserving of courtesy, respect, and safe passage to their destination. The transformation was permanent. The legacy would last forever. The story of Zara Mitchell and Captain Derek Hawkins serves as a powerful reminder that true justice isn't about revenge or punishment alone. It's about creating change that protects others from experiencing the same injustice. When someone shows you who they are through their actions, believe them, but also remember that systems can be changed when people refuse to accept discrimination as normal. Zara didn't just get even with the man who assaulted her. She rebuilt an entire industry to ensure that what happened to her could never happen to anyone else. Her story proves that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice isn't anger or retaliation, but the quiet determination to build something better from the wreckage of what was broken. If this story of courage, dignity, and transformation moved you, please subscribe to our channel and hit that like button to help us share more stories that matter. These tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things to make the world more just need to reach as many people as possible, because change happens when we all decide that dignity isn't negotiable and that everyone deserves respect regardless of what they look like or where they come from.